moglie, mulier, maravilla. These words have what I consider to be one of the most beautiful sounds in the Romance languages. That ever so slight rolling of the tongue against the hard palate that produces that l sound that we see in tagliatelle, for example. Now, how lovely that sound is of course in part a question of personal opinion. But what is indisputable is that these sounds hardly existed, if they existed at all, in Latin. Yet the Romance languages are rife from them. And given that the Romance languages come from Latin, that can lead us to ask, well, why? Where do these come from? According to many experts, we need to look at how the Romans pronounced their Latin. And that's what we're going to do in this episode. So what we're talking about here is a kind of palatalization. And palatalization is a very broad term. It's a broad phonetic term describing any diachronic phonological movement, that is to say, a sound change across time that sees one sound that was pronounced further back in the mouth later being pronounced closer to the palate or on the palate. A good example is how the relatively unpalatalized t could become ch over time. You can see we move from articulating that t further away from the palate, but ch requires pressing the tongue against the palate. The particular kind of palatalization we're concerned with in this video refers to a greater flattening of the tongue against the hard palate. The movement from the basic lateral alveolar proximant l that we find in lily or lobster towards that l that we find in gli azzurri in Italian or trabalho in Portuguese. It's represented by this symbol here in the International Phonetic Alphabet. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I like to think of this almost as a kind of rolling of the tongue along the palate. It's very clearly not merely an articulation by pressing the tongue against the palate. There's something a little bit more there, although, of course, that could be explained by the fact that in the Romance languages, as far as I understand it, only ever appears before a vowel. So maybe I'm confusing that vowel pronunciation with the articulation in question. So where does how Romans pronounce Latin fit into all this? Well, the simple answer is that Latin had very clear and distinct syllables. In fact, Latin poetry functioned largely according to the judicious disposition of those syllables according to a preset meter. And this is interesting because, of course, Romance language poetry fundamentally functions according to a rhyming scheme, and Germanic poetry traditionally privileged alliteration and the coining of new words, the so-called kennings that we find in Anglo-Saxon poetry. But as I said, a Roman poet would largely be praised on how he cleverly and carefully set his distinct syllables into a metric scheme. Now, that's a bit difficult to understand unless we give you an example. So if you look at the Latin word for reason, ratione, Romans would have pronounced that as ratione, 4 distinct syllables. But what seems to have happened over time, and the causes for this are disputed and we'll address them a little bit later in the video, is that that very clear syllabic distinction started to decay over time. For example, forma ratione might have been pronounced ratione. It's difficult to provide an exact time scheme for this, but we can be certain that as you socially and chronologically moved away from that golden standard of classic Latin, we would see this phenomenon crop up more regularly. An example that's useful for us here is how the Latin word for woman, muliere, with 4 distinct syllables, might have reduced to 3, muliere. With this change in syllabic distinction comes also a change in vowel quality. You would have noticed that in both of those instances I pointed out before, we move from monophthongs to the formation of diphthongs. Muliere becomes muliere, moving from I and E to ye. And as we know, often a phonological change within a single word doesn't remain isolated. It can set off a domino effect. Specifically, the consonants in these new syllables with diphthong vowels, are pronounced further along the palate. It's only a short step from muliere to the modern Portuguese bisyllabic mulier, or the Italian muller. The Latin filia over time would have become something like figlia, and from there we get the modern Portuguese filia and Italian figlia. And now we can actually approach this schematically. The Latin mirabilia gives us Italian meraviglia, Portuguese maraviglia, and Spanish maravilla. More on that later. Latin for straw, palea, gives us Italian paglia and Portuguese palia. Latin for folia gives us Italian folia and Portuguese folia. What set off this change initially, as I mentioned before, is a source of dispute amongst historical linguists. Ramon Menendez Pidal posits that it's because Latin was being spoken faster after the golden age of Ciceronian and Virgilian compositions finished. I am a little bit skeptical about that because from my readings of other sources, how fast Latin was spoken is something that historical linguists are very wary of asserting any positions on. Maybe you know a little bit more about that, so let me know in the comments below if that's the case. But the keen-eyed amongst you might have spotted a few gaps here. Firstly, I've only spoken about one kind of palatalization, the movement from the lateral alveolar proximant l to the l we see in modern Romance. I haven't, for example, looked at the broader changes from what we might want to consider harder consonants to the softer consonants. For example, how did Caesar become Cesare, or even Caesar in English? And secondly, you'll notice something about the Spanish and French examples I've used in the video so far. Firstly, I've been quite selective about them, pronouncing the one Spanish example in a form that, while still present in certain Spanish-speaking regions, most Spanish speakers would consider a little bit archaic. That palatalized l for the double L is not usually how that consonant is pronounced, of course. But then even beyond that, you might have thought, why didn't I continue with the example of woman, mulier in Latin, becoming muller in Italian, mulier in Portuguese, but mujer in Spanish? Well, my simple answer here is that both for the Spanish and the French, the story is a little bit more complex. Spanish and French tended not to be as conservative as either modern Italian or Portuguese are. In fact, they took this palatalization movement a little bit further than the other Romance languages we've considered in this video. And I did try squeeze everything into this video, but unfortunately, we're going to have to dedicate the subsequent episode to looking at how Spanish and French took this development in their phonological history. I hate leaving you on a cliffhanger. You come here to get full answers for the videos, and I appreciate the time that you spend watching this. So I regretfully have to ask you to keep an eye out for the next video when we will cover this particularly interesting phenomenon, because the deeper I dug for my research, the more fascinating it became. And I'm really keen on sharing what I found with all of you. So I beg your patience. And as always, I want to thank you for watching this video. You will have noticed that with the recent growth in the channel, I've not been able to answer all of the comments. I really do try get to them. So hopefully, if I haven't answered your comment on a video previously, I will get there soon. I'm not trying to be rude at all, but I'm going to leave it at that. Come back for our next video, which should hopefully release later on this week, in which we will look at how French and Spanish approached this palatalization. It's a truly fascinating story. But for now, I'm going to finish off, say thank you, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao, and até logo. Oh, one final note before I leave you. I did also try include more Romanian and Catalan in this video, but as the script was already getting extremely bloated, I had to shave those off, largely because I don't want to make serious mistakes in pronunciation or historical accuracy there. So begging your forgiveness for that. Enjoy the outro. I'll see you soon.